On a bright February morning, a bell rang from a ferry buried beneath winter snow. Standing alone on its empty deck was Vesper, a German shepherd Everett Marlowe had not seen in 4 years. Her frozen paws, torn boot, and lighthouse tag carried a message no radio could deliver. Across the bay, Cedar Lantern Island had gone silent, and its guiding light had disappeared. But reaching the island would demand more than one man's courage or one dog's loyalty. It would force Everett to learn that sometimes the strongest choice is letting others share the weight. Tell us where you are watching from, and please like and subscribe to help SEAL K9 Heroes reach 1,000 subscribers. The bell rang before Everett Marlowe had finished opening the blinds. It was a single iron note from the harbor, clear enough to travel through the February air and strike the windows of his radio shop. Everett stopped with one hand still gripping the cord. Outside, Aurora Bay shone beneath a pale blue sky. Snow covered the roofs, the empty parking spaces, and the wooden walkways along the harbor. Sunlight spread across the frozen inlet until the surface looked polished and harmless. Nothing moved except a loose strand of rope tapping against a dock post. The bell rang again. This time Everett knew exactly where it came from. The north wind. The ferry had been placed in winter storage nearly 2 months earlier. Its passenger cabin was dark, its engine systems drained, and its deck covered by a clean layer of snow. No one had any reason to be aboard it. Everett let the blind fall. For several seconds, he remained behind the counter, as though the workbench might protect him from whatever waited outside. A half-repaired marine radio sat beneath his lamp, its metal case open and its wires arranged with the care of a surgeon's instruments. Beside it lay a flathead screwdriver with a faded red handle. Machines made sense when they were opened. A failed circuit did not hide its motives. A loose connection did not blame you for finding it too late. The bell sounded a third time. Everett pulled on his old navy canvas coat. Its orange rescue lining showed briefly at the collar before he closed the zipper. Beneath it, he wore a softened olive combat shirt and brown work trousers with a screwdriver pressing against one cargo pocket. He pushed a charcoal wool cap over his dark, silver-threaded hair and stepped outside. The cold caught the clean planes of his face immediately. Wind reddened his cheeks and moved through the harbor with a sharper edge than the bright mornings suggested. Everett had spent enough winters near Lake Michigan to distrust beautiful weather. Blue skies could hide pressure changes. Sunlight could disguise weak ice. A quiet harbor could make a man forget that the lake was always moving beneath whatever shape winter forced upon it. He crossed the road toward the docks. The north wind rested against its berth like a large animal in sleep, its white upper cabin dull beneath frost, and its dark hull held motionless by thick lines. Snow covered the gangway. At first, Everett saw nothing unusual. Then a German shepherd appeared beside the port railing. The dog stood with its front legs braced wide, head lowered toward a short emergency rope installed near deck level. It caught the leather grip between its teeth and pulled. The bell answered above the wheelhouse. Everett stopped at the foot of the gangway. Vesper. The dog released the rope. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking her. The honey-gold fur along her chest and legs had darkened with melted snow, while the black saddle over her back remained dusted white. A small crescent of pale fur showed under her chin when she raised her head. Her left ear stood straight. The tip of the right angled slightly outward, giving her an alert but permanently questioning expression. She looked older than the last time Everett had seen her. Not old, more settled. The narrow, restless energy of a young working dog had become something quieter and more deliberate. but she was exhausted. Her sides moved too quickly. One gray paw protector hung torn from her rear left foot, and ice had formed in small beads along the feathering of her legs. The dark teal rescue harness around her body was slightly twisted, as though she had pushed through brush or climbed over something narrow. Everett climbed the gangway. Vesper did not rush to him. She stood still and watched his approach, her amber eyes fixed on his face. 4 years had passed since he had last worked beside her, yet Everett remembered the precision of that gaze. Vesper had never looked at people casually. She studied breathing, posture, hands, and the small changes most humans hoped no one else noticed. He stopped a few feet away. "You pulled that line exactly once when I taught you." Vesper's mouth opened slightly as she breathed. Everett glanced at the low emergency rope. He had helped install it during a winter training program, back when Northwind still carried rescue teams across the bay. The dogs had been trained to pull it if their handlers became unresponsive, or if a drill required them to summon help from another part of the vessel. Vesper had disliked the bell. The first time she triggered it, the sound had startled her so badly that she had backed into Everett's legs. He had crouched beside her, one hand resting against her shoulder, while Laurel Finch laughed from the wheelhouse, not at the dog, at Everett. You look more frightened than she does," Laurel had said. "I understand machinery that works quietly." "Then you chose the wrong profession." The memory arrived without warning, complete with Laurel's dry voice and the smell of wet rope. Everett shut it down before it could open into anything larger. He lowered one hand. Vesper crossed the space between them and pressed her cold nose into his palm. The contact lasted less than a second. Then she turned toward the open lake. Cedar Lantern Island sat almost 2 miles from shore, a low white shape beneath the winter sun. Dark pines rose from its center, and at the northern end, the old lighthouse stood on a separate rocky point. Everett followed Vesper's line of sight. The lighthouse was visible. Its signal was not. In daylight, the rotating beacon could be difficult to see from shore, but there should have been a regular white flash against the shadowed side of the tower. Everett counted without meaning to. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Nothing. He looked down at Vesper's harness. A round brass tag hung beneath her throat. It bore the outline of Cedar Lantern's lighthouse, worn smooth around the edges from years of use. Tied beside it was a narrow strip of blue-green fabric. Everett touched it carefully. Laurel owned a winter coat that color. She had worn it through 3 seasons of training, refusing to replace it even after the cuffs began to fray. Everett remembered her saying that a coat did not become useless merely because it showed where it had been. The strip had not torn away by accident. It was knotted twice around the harness ring, a message without words. Vesper had not wandered from the island. Laurel had sent her. Everett crouched and examined the dog's legs. Frozen droplets clung above her paws. A thin line of gray mud marked her lower belly, the kind found along the southern maintenance causeway when warmer water pushed through cracks in the ice. She had followed the winter markers across the low spit connecting the island to the mainland. The route had probably held when she started. Judging by the water frozen into her coat, the last section had already begun breaking apart beneath her. The realization left Everett with a strange, hollow sensation. Vesper had crossed before the way closed. She might not be able to return the same way. He stood and reached for the handheld radio clipped inside his coat. The unit was old but dependable. He selected the island frequency. "Cedar Lantern Station, this is Aurora Bay Shore. Respond." Only static. He adjusted the dial. "Laurel, this is Everett." He had not intended to use her name. The static continued, soft and indifferent. Vesper stepped closer to the rail. Everett tried the Lighthouse maintenance channel, followed by the emergency frequency. He heard a distant fragment from a commercial vessel farther north, then nothing from Cedar Lantern. The silence troubled him more than a distress call might have. A distress call provided facts. A voice could say whether someone was injured, whether power had failed, whether the building was secure. Silence made room for every possibility. Everett looked toward the southern side of the island. From this distance, the marked maintenance route was almost invisible against the frozen bay. A thin silver line cut through the white where water had opened near the causeway. The wind had changed. He could see it now in the direction of powder moving over the lake. Snow streamed eastward in low ribbons, while the flags above the harbor still hung nearly still. The shift had begun over the open water before reaching town. Everett's fingers tightened around the radio. He had once built his life around noticing changes before they became emergencies. Then one change had arrived faster than his judgment. After that, he had spent 10 years repairing devices other people used to call for help. It was close enough to service to let him sleep some nights, far enough from responsibility to let him survive the others. Vesper turned away from the island and walked toward the gangway. For one hopeful moment, Everett thought she had accepted that he would take her to Delaney Frost, the harbor master. Delaney had staff, access codes, emergency procedures, and none of Everett's history. "Good," he said quietly. "We'll get you warm. Delaney can decide what happens next." Vesper followed him down the gangway. Her rear left foot slipped once. Everett caught the handle on her harness before she fell. He felt the tremor running through her muscles. At the bottom, he released the handle and stepped onto the dock. Vesper did not follow. Everett turned. She stood halfway down the gangway watching him. "Come on." Vesper looked back toward Northwind's deck. Delaney's office is 50 yards away. The dog remained still. Everett climbed one step and reached for her harness. Vesper allowed him to guide her down. She did not resist, pull away, or bare her teeth. She walked beside him with the obedient weariness of a dog conserving the last of its strength. They made it 10 yards along the dock. Then Vesper stopped. She turned, walked back to the gangway, climbed aboard Northwind, and pulled the bell rope. The iron note rolled across the frozen harbor. Something inside Everett shifted. Not courage, not yet. The sound struck a much older place, a warning tone inside a rescue helicopter, a blinking panel, a gloved hand pointing toward weather closing around the aircraft. Curtis Hale's voice asking for confirmation through the headset. Everett's breath shortened. The harbor disappeared without actually changing. Sunlight remained on the snow. Northwind remained tied to the dock. Vesper remained on the deck, but his body had remembered another machine, another cold morning, another moment when continuing and turning back had both carried consequences. His right hand began to shake. He closed it around the edge of his coat. No. The word was meant for the memory, but it sounded as if he were speaking to the dog. Vesper released the rope. She came down from the ferry slowly. Everett wanted to step away before she reached him. He had no desire to be observed so closely, especially by an animal he had helped train to recognize exactly what he was trying to hide. Vesper stopped beside his left leg. She did not paw at him or demand his attention. She simply leaned her shoulder against his shin. Her weight was warm despite the ice in her coat. Everett stared over the dog's back at Cedar Lantern. Laurel had once explained that grounding behavior did not erase fear. It gave the body one reliable fact to hold, while fear moved through it. Everett had dismissed the phrase as something designed for brochures. Now he felt the steady pressure of Vesper's shoulder, the rough canvas of her harness beneath his fingertips, and the slow adjustment of her breathing as she matched her body to his. One reliable fact: the dog was here. The lighthouse was dark, the radio was silent, and Laurel had sent Vesper to him. Everett drew a breath through his nose and let it out slowly, then another. His hand stopped shaking enough for him to touch the brass lighthouse tag. "You remembered the bell?" he said. Vesper lifted her head. Everett looked at Northwind. Snow lay untouched across most of the deck, except for Vesper's tracks, a scattered path leading directly to the emergency rope. She had not searched the harbor. She had known where to go. Perhaps Laurel had given the command. Perhaps years of training had connected the ferry, the bell, and Everett in Vesper's memory. It did not matter which explanation was correct. Both carried the same meaning. Someone on Cedar Lantern believed Everett would still answer. The thought hurt more than being forgotten would have. He had built a quiet life around the assumption that no one should rely on him again. It was safer to repair radios after the voices had gone home. Safer to hand finished equipment across the counter. Safer to remain useful in ways that could not cost anyone much. Vesper pressed closer when his breathing changed again. Everett rested his palm against the side of her neck. Beneath the damp fur, he could feel the pulse running fast but steady. She had crossed failing ice. She had climbed onto a sleeping ferry. She had rung a bell she once feared. Not because she expected Everett to become the man he had been 10 years earlier. Dogs did not ask people to become their younger selves. They only asked what they were willing to do now. Everett looked once more toward the island. The bright winter morning no longer seemed empty. It seemed paused, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had changed beneath its surface. He lowered his gaze to Vesper. "All right," he said. The dog's ears lifted. "I understand. Something's wrong." Vesper remained against his leg. Everett tightened his hand gently around the harness handle, not to restrain her, but to make the promise physical enough for both of them to feel. But this time, nobody goes alone. 20 minutes after Everett agreed that no one would go alone, the harbor maintenance shed had become the busiest room in Aurora Bay. A folding table stood beneath fluorescent lights, covered with weather printouts, harbor charts, inspection folders, and 3 cups of coffee no one had remembered to drink. Through the open service door, the Northwind rested at its berth beneath the winter sun, while thin steam rose from the equipment Jonah and Boyd had already begun carrying aboard. Vesper lay on a rubber mat near a portable heater. Someone had removed the torn protector from her rear paw, dried the ice from her coat, and wrapped the foot in a clean gray boot. She was still breathing harder than usual, but her eyes followed every person entering the shed. Delaney Frost stood at the head of the table. The harbor master was shorter than Everett, broad through the shoulders, with wind-marked skin and cropped salt and pepper hair pressed flat beneath a dark red wool cap. A steel whistle hung from a matching cord at her collar. She had spent most of her adult life aboard working vessels and possessed the calm authority of someone who rarely needed to raise her voice. "Start with what we know," she said. She did not ask Everett to explain how he felt about the situation. She did not praise him for coming. That was one of the reasons he trusted her. Celeste Harmon spread a laminated satellite image across the table. Tall and composed, she wore an ivory weather shell over a navy thermal layer. Orange-tinted safety glasses rested on top of her dark hair, which was gathered into a low knot streaked naturally with silver. The temperature at the island station rose 7 degrees between midnight and 5, she said. That does not sound dramatic until you combine it with the southeast current. She placed one finger along the southern maintenance route. This is where Vesper crossed. The causeway itself is still above water, but the final section runs over shallow ice. At dawn, it may have held. It will not hold now. Everett looked toward Vesper. The dog's wrapped rear foot rested slightly apart from the others. She had chosen the only available window. Celeste continued. The wind is expected to turn northwest by early afternoon. Once it does, the loose surface ice will begin moving back into the southern channel. We have approximately 5 hours before the bay becomes significantly harder to navigate, possibly less. How much less? Delaney asked. If the pressure falls as quickly as the lake buoy suggests, 2. No one commented on the difference. Adrian Cross stood near the end of the table with a leather document case open in front of him. He was the youngest person in the room by several years, though the silver beginning at his temples made him appear older in the bright overhead light. His camel-colored coat had been folded carefully over a chair, leaving him in a dark green V-neck sweater and pale blue shirt. He looked like a man prepared for a council meeting, not a winter rescue. That did not make his concern less serious. The state response coordinator estimates 4 hours before a team can reach Aurora Bay, Adrian said. Their nearest winter unit is handling a highway pileup west of here. Air support is available only if conditions remain within limits. 4 hours puts them here as the wind changes, Celeste said. I understand that. Do you? Adrian closed the folder in front of him but kept one hand resting on it. I understand that if we launch an unprepared municipal vessel with an incomplete crew and something happens, Aurora Bay could lose its emergency coverage entirely. 3 years ago, this town spent 14 months defending a claim after a volunteer truck slid off County Road 9. We nearly lost the fire service contract. His voice was measured rather than defensive. Everett had expected resistance from him. Instead, he heard the memory of a different emergency. One Adrian had been responsible for surviving in paperwork long after everyone else went home. Delaney tapped the harbor chart. No one is suggesting we ignore procedure. The north wind has been winterized, not decommissioned. That distinction will matter very little if an insurer decides the crew acted outside the operating plan. Delaney's expression did not change. Then we build an operating plan before we leave. The side door opened, and Jonah Kessler entered carrying a clipboard smudged with grease. He was tall and narrow, with a slight bend through the shoulders and thick white hair curling above his ears. A short white mustache moved when he spoke. His cobalt coveralls were open at the collar over a gray sweater, and a folding wooden ruler protruded from one chest pocket. Starboard cooling line is dry, as expected, he said. Intake housing looks clean. We still need to pressure test the seals. Behind him came Boyd Kellerman, shorter and heavier, wearing dark green mechanic's coveralls beneath a brown canvas jacket. A yellow pencil sat behind his right ear. Black-framed glasses had slipped halfway down his nose, and a red shop rag hung from his rear pocket. Boyd looked at the room as if meetings were an unfortunate side effect of machinery. The battery heaters are responding, he said. Port unit slower than I like. Unsafe? Delaney asked. Slower than I like. That was not the question. Boyd pushed his glasses higher. Not unsafe yet. Jonah laid the clipboard on the table. If we find no damage, we can return basic systems within 90 minutes. That gives us propulsion, steering, deck heat, navigation, and emergency pumps. What about passenger systems? Adrian asked. We are not running a passenger route, Jonah replied. We are making an emergency crossing with a restricted crew. Life rafts? In storage. Where? Boyd exhaled through his nose. The warehouse behind you. Adrian met the mechanic's stare without reacting. Then they need to be inspected and loaded before departure. For the first time, Boyd seemed to reconsider him. "Correct," he said. The conversation shifted, not because anyone had won, but because the argument had become practical. Delaney began assigning checks. Jonah and Boyd would restore the vessel systems. Adrian would contact the state coordinator, municipal insurer, and county emergency office. Celeste would maintain a live weather assessment. Tessa Rourke, the town's senior emergency medical technician, would prepare supplies for cold exposure, fractures, and evacuation. Tessa had arrived quietly while the others were speaking. She wore a burgundy emergency jacket with silver reflective strips and black rescue trousers. Her dark hair was braided over her left shoulder, and orange trauma shears were clipped to the front of her vest. She knelt beside Vesper and checked the dog's gums, paws, and breathing. "She can travel," Tessa said, "but she is not running anywhere again today." Vesper looked at her without disagreement. Tessa glanced toward Everett. "That applies to the rest of us too. Nobody decides fatigue is a personality flaw." I did not say anything. "You have a face that saves time." Delaney almost smiled. The people on Cedar Lantern were counted again. Laurel Finch, Ruth Calder, Miriam Tate, Felix Ward, and Simon Drake. 5 adults. The island lodge had lost power. The radio station did not answer. Simon might have gone to the Lighthouse before communications failed, but no one could confirm it. The backup heating system in the lodge could last several hours if it had started correctly. If it had not, the greenhouse at the center of the island would be the warmest structure. Everett listened as each possibility became a task rather than a fear. Tessa assembled warming blankets. Celeste marked wind projections. Adrian began calling agencies. Jonah and Boyd returned to Northwind. Delaney watched Everett across the table. "You still hold the commercial endorsement?" "Yes." "When did you last use it?" 11 years ago. Boyd, halfway through the door, stopped. "That is not recent." "No." "Does your license remain valid?" "Yes." "Experience does not expire," Boyd said. "Coordination does." Everett accepted the correction. "I know." Delaney folded her arms. "I can command the vessel legally. I know the marked channel and current harbor plan. What I do not have is your history with the southern winter route. I helped survey it before the new buoys were installed, with Celeste and me." Everett nodded. The distinction mattered. He had not discovered the route alone. He did not own it. Celeste slid a transparent sheet over the chart. The main navigation channel had been shaded red, where drifting ice was already accumulating. "The official route is becoming narrow here," she said. "The maintenance channel south of the causeway is still open, but only barely. It was never intended for regular ferry traffic." "Northwind used it twice during ice surveys," Delaney said. "Both times with reduced load," Everett added. And different wind," Celeste replied. No one reached for a conclusion. The old Everett would have wanted one immediately. He would have studied the chart until uncertainty could be forced into a single answer. Instead, he heard Jonah's tools striking metal aboard the ferry, Boyd calling out pressure readings, and Adrian repeating insurance language into the phone. Responsibility had become noisy. It involved other people correcting one another. Vesper stood from the mat. Tessa reached for the harness, but the dog did not head toward the door. She walked to Everett, paused, then continued toward Northwind. "Vesper," Tessa called. The shepherd stopped and looked back. Everett followed. "She may need to relieve herself." "She just walked past the open yard," Tessa said. Vesper climbed the gangway at a controlled pace. The torn paw protector had been replaced, and she favored the leg only slightly. Everett stayed close enough to steady her without touching the harness. Inside the dark passenger cabin, Vesper moved toward the forward stairwell. She descended to the lower corridor and stopped at a metal cabinet beneath the wheelhouse. The cabinet had been used during rescue training to store navigation aids, spare harnesses, and scent cloths. Laurel had spent enough time that Vesper would have known the location by routine and smell. The dog sat in front of it. Everett opened the latch. Most of the equipment had been removed for winter storage, but several rolled charts remained in a waterproof tube. He carried them into the wheelhouse and spread them over the console. Vesper placed her front paws near the threshold, but did not enter until he gave permission. The top chart was familiar. Everett recognized his own handwriting along the lower edge, faded blue notes from a survey 6 winters earlier. Delaney's block lettering marked water depth. Celeste had drawn wind arrows and temperature ranges in green. A 4th note appeared near the southern channel. It was written in Laurel's slanted hand. This route works only when everyone keeps talking. Everett stared at the sentence. It had probably been a joke about radio discipline. Laurel had a habit of turning technical instructions into statements that sounded more personal than necessary. Yet the chart had remained aboard all these years, not as a hidden message, not as fate, simply as a record of people who had once worked together. Delaney entered behind him. "You found the old survey." Vesper remembered the cabinet. "She remembers Laurel using it." Everett nodded. Delaney studied the chart. "This helps, but it does not make the route safe." "No." "Good." She keyed the wheelhouse radio. "Harbor Shed, this is Northwind. Begin recording." Adrian's voice answered through static. "Recording active." Delaney spoke slowly. "Emergency planning log, 10:42 hours. Proposed deployment of municipal ferry Northwind to Cedar Lantern Island. Vessel currently in scheduled winter layup, not mechanical suspension. Reactivation inspection underway under Jonah Kessler and Boyd Kellerman." She looked at Everett. "Proposed operator Everett Marlowe, valid commercial endorsement, prior experience on this route. Command authority remains with Harbor Master Delaney Frost." Everett understood what she was doing. She was not granting him the vessel. She was placing him inside a system where authority, knowledge, and accountability were separated rather than carried by one person. Delaney continued. "All route changes require concurrence from navigation, weather, and engineering leads. Medical lead retains authority over crew fitness. Shore coordinator retains authority to abort for legal or state emergency reasons." Adrian was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Add that the mission remains provisional until written emergency coverage is confirmed." Delaney added it. Everett expected the arrangement to feel restrictive. Instead, it felt unexpectedly light. The next hour moved without ceremony. Life rafts were inspected and loaded. Engine heaters came online. Jonah called out pressure values from below deck, while Boyd recorded temperature changes at 2-minute intervals. Tessa secured medical cases beneath the passenger benches. Celeste mounted a portable weather display beside the navigation console. Adrian entered the wheelhouse carrying a signed authorization printed on town letterhead. "The county has accepted the incident command request," he said. "The municipal insurer has confirmed emergency coverage, provided we follow the recorded plan." Delaney took the paper. "You got that quickly." "I was persuasive." Boyd's voice rose through the engine intercom. "Port battery heater stable. Cooling line holds pressure. I am willing to stop complaining for approximately 4 minutes." Jonah answered from somewhere behind him. "That would be a harbor record." The first engine turned over. The sound traveled through Northwind's hull as a deep mechanical shudder. Snow slipped from the upper rail and scattered across the dock. Vesper lifted her head, but did not move from beside the wheelhouse door. The second engine started 30 seconds later. Everett stood at the console with both hands resting near the controls, but not yet touching them. The instruments glowed awake one after another, illuminating systems that had been silent since December. Delaney checked the departure list. Engineering? Ready within limits, Jonah replied. Weather? Celeste looked toward the bay. Southern Channel remains open. Wind shift beginning earlier than forecast, but still manageable. Medical? Ready, Tessa said. Shore command? Adrian stood on the dock with the radio in one hand and his document case in the other. Authorization active. State response notified. I will remain on this frequency. Delaney looked at Everett. Navigation? He studied the bright water, the low causeway, and the thin movement of ice along the southern edge of the bay. Ready to proceed under the recorded route. Delaney gave the order to release the lines. North wind eased away from the berth, while sunlight flashed across the snow piled along the harbor. The engine vibration rose through Everett's boots, familiar enough to stir memory, but different enough not to belong to it. Vesper stood near the wheelhouse, her amber eyes moving between the windows and Everett. She did not stare constantly towards Cedar Lantern. She did not need to. The ferry was moving now. Each time a radio call entered or an instrument sounded, Vesper glanced at Everett, attentive but still. Everett kept one hand near the throttle and the other beside the chart marked by 4 sets of handwriting. Outside, Aurora Bay began to fall behind them. Ahead, the winter lake shone beneath a clear sky, beautiful enough to hide every difficult decision waiting beneath its surface. Northwind entered the southern channel at 11:19, moving slowly enough that the engine vibration felt more like a pulse than forward motion. The water was not truly open. It appeared in dark, narrow lanes between plates of ice, some no wider than the ferry itself. Sunlight reflected from the frozen surfaces with such force that Everett had to lower the tinted visor above the wheelhouse windows. From a distance, the route looked clean. Up close, it was always changing. Delaney stood beside the chart table, one hand resting near the radio. Celeste occupied the port window with her weather monitor and binoculars. Jonah remained below deck near the engine controls, while Boyd moved between the machinery spaces and the rear observation panel, reporting temperatures in the same dry tone he might have used during an ordinary inspection. Tessa had secured her medical cases against the passenger benches. She sat near Vesper, checking the dog's wrapped paw every few minutes without making a ceremony of it. Everett kept Northwind slightly below the power limit Jonah had approved. The first problem appeared less than 10 minutes after departure. Red buoy ahead is west of charted position, Delaney said. Everett saw it half buried in wind-packed ice, tilted almost flat against the surface. Dragged by pressure, Celeste said. The channel marker cannot be trusted. Delaney did not tell Everett where to steer. She read the shoreline bearings from the survey chart, while Celeste compared them with the current wind direction. Everett adjusted the ferry 3 degrees south. Northwind's bow pushed a thin skin of new ice aside. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it ran along the hull like paper being torn. Boyd's voice came through the intercom. Cooling intake temperature is rising. How fast? Jonah asked. 2 degrees in 4 minutes. Reduce another 10%. Everett eased back the throttle. The ferry slowed. Behind them, pieces of broken ice drifted together and began closing the route they had just used. Vesper stood near the wheelhouse entrance. balanced easily despite the movement of the deck. She was not staring toward the island now. Her attention moved between the crew, following changes in voices and posture. Everett noticed the difference. On shore, she had been asking for action. Here, she was working. A large sheet of ice moved out from the causeway and crossed the planned route at an angle. It was not moving quickly, but its size made speed irrelevant. Delaney studied it through the front glass. "Can we pass ahead of it?" Celeste shook her head. "Not without increasing power." Jonah answered through the intercom before Everett could ask. "Increased power raises intake risk." Everett watched the distance close. Years earlier, he would have made the calculation privately and acted before the discussion finished. Speed had once felt like clarity. A fast decision created the impression that uncertainty had been defeated. Now he waited. "Alternative?" Delaney asked. Everett pointed to a darker strip of water near the shallows. "We can fall behind the sheet and use its wake. It will put us closer to the causeway than the chart recommends." Celeste checked the depth notes. "Still enough clearance if the current has not deposited new sediment." "Jonah?" "Acceptable at low speed." Delaney nodded. "Take us behind it." Everett turned north wind away from the direct route. The movement felt wrong for several seconds, as though yielding space to the ice meant surrendering control. Then the sheet passed in front of them. A narrow lane opened behind it. Everett guided the ferry through. No one congratulated him. That helped. The crossing was not a test he needed to win. It was a problem the group needed to keep solving. Halfway to Cedar Lantern, the navigation display flickered. The digital chart froze, corrected itself, then disappeared into a gray screen. A warning tone sounded. Everett's hands tightened on the controls. The noise was not identical to the alert from the helicopter 10 years earlier. It did not need to be. His body recognized the shape of interruption before his mind had time to name the difference. The wheelhouse narrowed around him. For one disorienting second, sunlight on the lake became the white glare outside an aircraft window. The ferry's vibration rose into the remembered beat of rotor blades. He heard Curtis through a headset that was no longer there. Everett's breathing shortened. Delaney saw it. She did not reach for the controls. "Back up, bearing 217, she said evenly. Celeste looked through the starboard window. "Wind remains southeast, 12 knots, shore marker visible." Jonah's voice followed through the intercom. "Maintain reduced power. Engineering stable." Vesper crossed the small space and leaned her shoulder against Everett's left leg. The pressure was familiar now, but the moment was not the same as the dock. At the harbor, Vesper had helped him choose to respond. Here, she helped him remain inside a decision already shared with other people. Everett looked at the magnetic compass. 217. He found the dark pine line of the island beyond the glare. "I have the bearing," he said. Delaney repeated it into the mission log. Everett corrected the ferry's heading without increasing speed. The navigation screen returned 12 seconds later. No one pretended those 12 seconds had not mattered. No one treated them as proof that Everett was unfit to continue. Delaney simply said, "Digital navigation is now secondary. We remain on visual and compass confirmation." Everett nodded. The rule made sense. More importantly, it did not feel like punishment. By the time Northwind approached Cedar Lantern, the bright morning had begun to lose its softness. Fine snow moved across the island in flat silver sheets. The pine branches remained still near the ground, while their upper tips bent toward the east. The dock appeared between two stone breakwaters. No one waited there. Everett reduced speed and brought the ferry alongside. Delaney handled the lines with Tessa while Boyd secured the stern. Vesper stepped onto the dock only after Laurel's absence became impossible to ignore. The dog stopped, lifted her muzzle, and tested the air. Everett expected her to pull toward the lighthouse. Instead, Vesper turned inland. A line of footprints crossed the snow toward the center of the island. They were orderly rather than frantic. Some were deep and wide, made by people carrying weight. Beside them ran the tracks of a narrow sled. "They moved supplies," Tessa said. The group followed the path through a stand of cedar and white pine. Cedar Lantern's winter lodge sat on the western rise, its dark windows facing the bay. No smoke came from the chimney. A row of emergency lights along the walkway had gone dark. Farther inland, the glass roof of the greenhouse caught the sun. Its panes had been partially covered with blankets and silver insulation sheets. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from a metal vent someone had fitted through one wall. When Everett opened the outer door, warm, damp air touched his face. The greenhouse had been transformed. Tables had been pushed together beneath the central glass roof. Sleeping bags lined one wall. Lanterns hung from hooks originally intended for vines. Jugs of water had been arranged near a small propane heater surrounded by bricks. No one inside looked helpless. Ruth Calder stood near the heater with a notebook in one hand. She was small, silver-haired, and straight-backed, with red reading glasses hanging from a cord against her plum-colored vest. A white-faced nurse's watch was pinned below one shoulder. She looked first at Vesper, then at Tessa's medical bags. "Good," Ruth said. "Someone brought equipment instead of speeches." Tessa set down the cases. "How many patients?" "5 people started the morning here. 3 are here now. 1 is cold sensitive. 1 has a heart condition. And all of us are tired of being called patients." At the far table, Miriam Tate closed a fountain pen and rose. She was tall, elegant, and composed despite the improvised shelter. Her gray and violet shawl had been folded over the back of a chair, revealing a dark navy turtleneck. Silver threaded through the waves of her shoulder-length hair. She carried herself with the stillness of someone accustomed to rooms becoming quieter when she spoke. "Miriam Tate," she said. "Former judge, current obstacle to anyone making foolish decisions on our behalf." Delaney removed her gloves. "Delaney Frost, harbor master, we are preparing to evacuate the island." "No," Miriam replied. The refusal was neither loud nor dramatic. That made it land harder. Ruth continued checking the propane gauge as if the conversation had been expected. Delaney looked around the greenhouse. "Power's down. The weather window is closing. North wind can carry everyone back." "Everyone is not here," Miriam said. Everett looked toward Ruth. Where are Laurel, Felix, and Simon?" Ruth's expression changed slightly at Laurel's name. "Simon went to the lighthouse before dawn after the radio signal began cutting out. He said the backup system had failed." "Laurel followed him?" "When he did not return." "And Felix?" Ruth pointed to a coil of rope missing from a storage rack. "He went with Laurel, came back once about an hour later, said the footbridge to the lighthouse point had shifted and Simon was injured but conscious. Felix took more rope and returned." Vesper moved to the northern side of the greenhouse. She stood near the door, not scratching or whining, simply facing the direction of the lighthouse. Everett felt the old urge rise, the need to compress uncertainty into command. "We load the 3 of you now," he said. "Then we return for the others." Miriam studied him. "You intend to leave 3 people at the lighthouse while taking a ferry away from the island?" We cannot move everyone at once if the route worsens. Then perhaps you should ask what has already been done before deciding what must happen next. Everett's patience tightened. The power is out. We noticed. The temperature is falling. We also noticed that. You have limited fuel. Miriam's gaze did not move. We calculated it. Ruth handed Tessa the notebook. Each page contained time intervals, heater use, medication schedules, interior temperatures, and food portions. They had not been waiting. They had been working. Miriam stepped closer to Everett. "Did you come here to help us?" she asked. "Or to decide for us because that makes you less afraid?" The question struck deeper than accusation. Everett looked toward the insulated walls, the ration chart, the sleeping area, and the sled marks outside. The islanders had responded before anyone reached them. His plan had assumed otherwise. Delaney read Ruth's notes. "How long can you maintain this temperature?" 3 hours at current fuel use, Ruth said. "Less if the wind strengthens." Tessa opened the medical storage bag. "Who needs the heart medication?" One of the residents who left the island last week forgot to take her reserve supply from the shared cabinet. Miriam uses the same prescription, but her current dose is stored in the lodge refrigerator. Miriam's expression tightened. "The lodge refrigerator is warming." "We need power," Tessa said. A radio call came from Northwind. Adrian's voice carried through static. "Cedar Lantern Team, State Air Unit is available for equipment transport. They can reach you in approximately 90 minutes if the weather remains open." Delaney answered from Ruth's handheld radio. "What can they bring?" "Portable generator, replacement regulator, emergency medication, and 1 technical responder. They cannot perform a full evacuation before the wind shift." Celeste looked through the greenhouse glass toward the northern point. "The aircraft will need a visual reference. Snow reflection around the island is already increasing." "Can they use coordinates?" Everett asked. "They have coordinates," Celeste said. "Coordinates do not show the safe approach angle between the lighthouse point, the trees, and the open water." Delaney keyed the radio. "What visual references do they require?" Adrian relayed the question. The answer returned a minute later. "Lighthouse beacon operatings if possible. Marked receiving zone near the main dock. 2 separate points of light so the pilot can read orientation in the snow." The room became quiet. The mission had changed again. Northwind alone could not solve the problem. Evacuation alone could not solve it either. They had people at the lighthouse, a failing heat supply, medication losing temperature control, and an aircraft that could bring what the island needed, only if the island helped guide it in. Everett looked at the faces around him. Delaney understood vessels. Celeste understood the weather. Tessa and Ruth understood the medical limits. Miriam understood the people who had already chosen to remain. No single order could contain all of that. Everett removed his gloves and placed them on the table. "We divide the work." Miriam waited. He forced himself not to speak as though the plan belonged only to him. "Tessa and Ruth stay here. Prepare the receiving area and decide who can travel if evacuation becomes necessary." Tessa nodded. Jonah and Boyd inspect the island generator and the electrical regulator. Delaney raised the radio. "I will coordinate from Northwind, maintain engine readiness, and keep shore command updated." Everett turned to Celeste. "You assess the route to the lighthouse point." "I assess it," she said. "I do not guarantee it." "Understood." Vesper had already moved toward the door. Everett clipped a safety line to her teal harness. "You are not leading us across anything until Celeste approves it." The dog looked at him. then toward the northern point. Miriam picked up Ruth's notebook. "What will you do?" Everett looked through the greenhouse glass at the distant lighthouse, its dark beacon standing against the bright winter sky. "I will go with Celeste and Vesper." Miriam held his gaze for a moment, measuring whether the answer contained an order or a choice. Then she nodded once. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees with a new, lower sound. Everett opened the greenhouse door. Cold air entered immediately, carrying fine snow from the north. Vesper stepped beside him, restrained by the safety line but ready. Behind them, the greenhouse returned to motion. Tessa opened medical cases. Ruth reorganized fuel. Delaney began issuing radio instructions. Miriam marked new times in the notebook. The island had not waited to be saved. It had only waited for the people from shore to understand how to join the work already underway. The lighthouse stood less than a mile from the greenhouse, yet the walk toward it felt like leaving the island entirely. Everett, Celeste, and Vesper followed a narrow service path through cedar trees bent beneath clean layers of snow. Sunlight passed between the branches in bright vertical bands, warming nothing. The wind had strengthened since north wind reached the island, but the trees broke it into uneven gusts that arrived without warning. Vesper moved beside Everett rather than ahead of him. A safety line ran from the handle of her teal harness to a carabiner at his belt. The arrangement limited her movement to several feet. She could stop, turn, and investigate the air, but she could not race toward the lighthouse if she caught Laurel's scent. Everett had expected her to protest. Instead, Vesper adjusted to the line immediately, matching his pace and glancing back whenever Celeste stopped to check her equipment. "Good training," Celeste said. "Good dog," Everett replied. "There is a difference." "There is." Celeste carried a long testing pole in one hand and a waterproof instrument case across her body. Her ivory shell stood out sharply against the dark trees. The orange lenses of her protective glasses had been lowered over her eyes to reduce the glare coming off the snow. The ground began to slope downward. Beyond the last row of cedars, the northern point came into view. The main island ended at a low stone shore. 60 yards beyond it, the lighthouse rose from a separate outcrop of dark rock. The tower was white, narrow, and weathered, with a red service building attached to its base. Between the island and the lighthouse point lay the frozen inlet. The floating footbridge that normally crossed the gap was no longer straight. One section remained fastened to the island, but the center had been pushed sideways by moving ice. Its railings formed a broken angle across the surface, and a gap of open water separated two sections. Several orange stakes marked an older winter route beside it. Everett stopped at the shoreline. The inlet looked solid. Fresh snow covered the ice in an almost perfect white sheet, disturbed only by the orange markers and 3 sets of footprints leading toward the lighthouse. The prints were partly filled by drifting powder. "What do you see?" Everett asked. Celeste did not answer immediately. She crouched, brushed snow away from the edge, and studied the color of the ice beneath. "I see a surface designed to make confident people careless." She extended the testing pole. "The western side has pressure ridges. The center is smoother, but that does not mean thicker. Water moves faster through this inlet than it does along the southern causeway." Everett looked at the footprints. "Those tracks crossed. Earlier. Felix came back and crossed again. Also earlier." The distinction was becoming the language of the day. Celeste attached a second rope to her climbing belt. Everett anchored the other end around a cedar trunk, then secured his own line. Vesper's tether was shortened, so she remained close to him. Celeste stepped onto the ice first. She tested the surface ahead, struck twice, then moved one careful step. The measuring device in her other hand took readings from the surface, but she treated the numbers as confirmation rather than permission. Everett followed several feet behind. The first section held firmly. Snow compressed beneath his boots with a dry sound. Beneath that, the ice gave occasional low groans, distant enough to seem disconnected from the surface. Vesper walked with her head slightly lowered. Everett watched her without depending on her. A dog could hear things he could not, but hearing did not equal understanding. Vesper's reaction might warn them to pause. Celeste's measurements would decide what came next. They passed the first orange stake. The footprints ahead divided. One set continued in a nearly straight line. Another curved closer to the damaged footbridge. Felix changed his route on the return trip, Celeste said. Why? He may have noticed softer ice, or he may simply have wanted the bridge rail within reach. The sun made the inlet difficult to read. Shadows from the lighthouse fell across one section, while the rest shone so brightly that depth and texture disappeared. They reached the third marker. Vesper stopped. The safety line tightened gently against Everett's belt. He turned. The shepherd's ears had lowered. Her mouth closed, and the muscles along her back became rigid. She was not looking toward the lighthouse or Laurel's tracks. Her attention remained fixed on the ice several feet ahead. Everett raised one hand. Hold! Celeste froze with one boot lifted. For several seconds, none of them moved. A faint vibration traveled through the surface. It was not the dramatic cracking sound Everett expected from films or training demonstrations. It was softer, an irregular tapping beneath the snow, as though small stones were being rolled under glass. Vesper shifted her weight backward. Celeste slowly lowered her foot to the place she had already tested, then crouched. She swept aside snow with one glove. A thin gray line appeared beneath it. The fracture was narrow, almost invisible, running diagonally across the path between two orange stakes. Celeste examined it with the pole. New pressure crack. How wide? Here, less than half an inch. That is not the important part. She pointed farther east, where the line disappeared beneath untouched snow. We cannot see where it joins the open water. Everett looked behind them. The route to shore remained clear. We return? Celeste studied the old markers. Not yet. Simon placed a second path closer to the bridge. It is longer, but the water beneath it is shallower. She pointed toward the curved footprints Felix had used. We back up one at a time. No turning in place. Everett gave Vesper a hand signal. The dog stepped backward with him, deliberate and controlled. Celeste followed after they reached the last marker. They had moved less than 20 feet when the abandoned section of ice gave a quiet, sighing sound. The line widened. A white slab several yards across separated from the route and began drifting slowly toward the open gap beside the damaged footbridge. No one spoke. The movement was not fast. That made it more unsettling. The surface they had been preparing to cross simply detached itself from the island and left. Vesper watched it go, then looked up at Everett. He felt no rush of triumph for having stopped in time. What he felt was smaller and more useful. Relief that he had listened before deciding. Your dog heard the movement, Celeste said, and you found the crack. And you stopped us. Everett looked at the drifting slab. None of those things would have been enough alone. Celeste gave him a brief glance, then returned to the route. No, she said. They would not. They crossed by the eastern markers. The path curved near the remains of the footbridge, where a handrail provided an additional anchor point. Celeste tested every few feet. Everett managed the lines, keeping Vesper behind him during the weakest section. When they stepped onto the dark rock of the lighthouse point, Vesper pulled forward for the first time. Not hard, just enough to make her intention clear. Everett released another foot of line. The dog moved toward the service building, nose working rapidly. A blue-green thread was caught on the corner of the door, the same color as Laurel's coat. Everett tried the handle. Unlocked. "Cedar Lantern," he called. "Everett Marlowe with the Aurora Bay team." A voice answered from inside. "About time." It was strained but unmistakably dry. Everett opened the door. The service room smelled of cold metal, damp wool, and machine oil. Tools lay across the floor near a collapsed section of the interior stairway. Laurel Finch knelt beside a man trapped beneath a heavy wooden support. She wore a brick-red parka over a forest-green fleece, both marked with dust from the damaged stair structure. Her brown-red hair, threaded with silver, had escaped from its tie and clung in damp strands near her face. At 55, Laurel had the composed gaze of someone who could acknowledge danger without giving it the whole room. Her eyes moved first to Everett, then to Vesper. The control in her expression broke for only a second. Vesper surged forward. Laurel lifted one hand. "Vesper, down!" The dog stopped immediately. Her body trembled with the effort of remaining in place. "Good girl," Laurel said, softer. "Simon first." Vesper crossed to the injured man and lay beside him. Simon Drake was long-limbed and thin, dressed in navy waterproof overalls beneath a bright red Lighthouse parka. His round, brass-framed glasses sat crooked across his narrow face. One leg was pinned below the knee by the fallen support, but he remained awake and alert. "I would stand to greet you," Simon said, "but the building has expressed a preference." His attempt at humor did not hide the shaking in his hands. Everett crouched beside the beam. "How long?" "Almost 2 hours," Laurel said. "The structure shifted once after Felix went upstairs. It has been stable since." "Where is Felix?" A voice came faintly from above. "Still enjoying the view." Everett looked up. Through the damaged stairwell, he could see Felix Ward leaning over the railing on the observation level. He had a broad face, close-cropped ash-blonde hair, and a short reddish-gray beard. An old brown fire service coat hung open over an orange wool shirt. A bent metal frame blocked the lower stair section beneath him. "The good news," Felix called, "is the lens assembly still works." "What is the bad news?" Celeste asked. "The motor does not. The radio battery is dead, and I cannot get past that frame without turning myself into a structural experiment." Celeste began examining the damaged stair supports. Everett contacted Tessa through the handheld radio. "We have Simon conscious, lower leg trapped, prolonged cold exposure. No visible major injury from this position." Tessa's voice returned immediately. "Check circulation below the pressure point. Keep him insulated. Do not move the support until you have controlled how the remaining structure is carrying weight." Laurel had already wrapped blankets around Simon's upper body. Vesper pressed against his side, her warmth and steady breathing giving him something to focus on. Simon rested one gloved hand against the dog's harness. "She left the island," he murmured. "Laurel sent her," Everett said. Simon looked toward Laurel. "I told you the crossing was failing." "You also told me you were fine," Laurel replied. "That was before the staircase developed opinions." Celeste placed one hand against the remaining support. "The beam can be lifted, but not until we brace this side. If it shifts toward the wall, It may pull the stair frame with it. Everett found a short jack and 2 timber blocks among Simon's tools. Laurel helped position them while Celeste monitored the structure. They worked without rushing. Everett lifted only when Celeste confirmed the load had transferred. Laurel pulled Simon's leg clear and checked his boot for movement and warmth under Tessa's instructions. Simon tried to sit up. Vesper stood across his path. He looked at her. "I see you have been assigned management." The dog remained still until Laurel gave the release command. With Simon free, Everett allowed himself to look toward the equipment room. The lighthouse's main LED lamp was still intact. Felix had removed the motor cover, revealing a gearbox clouded with frozen moisture. "The drive seized when the temperature dropped," Felix said from above. "The manual crank turns, but it is heavy. 2 people can keep the reflector moving for a short approach window." "And the radio?" Delaney asked through Everett's handheld. "Backup battery failed," Laurel said. "The wired set may work if North Wind supplies temporary power from the service connection." Delaney acknowledged and began speaking with Jonah aboard the ferry. The problem was no longer whether the beacon could function. It could. The problem was how many people it required. Simon needed to return to the greenhouse before his condition worsened. Felix remained trapped above the bent frame. The safe path across the inlet was weakening by the minute. The helicopter's arrival window continued to narrow. Everett looked from Simon to Felix, then to Laurel. "We end this," he said. "We get Felix down, take Simon back, and clear the point." Laurel stood slowly. "And the beacon?" "Northwind can try to guide the aircraft from the water. 1 light is not enough in reflected snow. Celeste already confirmed that. Then the aircraft turns back. And the generator stays on the mainland. We still have the ferry. The ferry cannot replace the regulator Jonah needs. It cannot protect Miriam's medication overnight. It cannot heat the greenhouse if the wind closes the channel before Northwind returns." Everett's voice became quieter. "I'm not leaving people in a damaged lighthouse while the ice route fails." "You are not leaving us," Laurel said. "You are deciding that none of us may stay. I know what happens when conditions change faster than the plan." "So do I." "You were not in that aircraft." "No." The word held no defensiveness. Laurel stepped closer, lowering her voice so Simon and Felix would not have to carry the weight of the argument. "But I spent 2 years watching you turn one terrible decision into a rule for every decision that came afterward." Everett looked away from her. Vesper remained beside Simon, following Laurel's command rather than the tension between the 2 humans. Laurel continued, "If we abandon the beacon, we are not choosing safety. We are choosing a different risk for everyone in the greenhouse. And if the inlet breaks completely, then we adapt. That is not a plan. No, it is what people do when plans meet reality." Everett looked up at the blocked stairway, the frozen mechanism and the cold daylight beyond the lighthouse windows. He wanted one answer that protected everyone. Laurel wanted the right to help decide which dangers they accepted. Neither of them was arguing for bravery. Neither was willing to call fear wisdom simply because it sounded responsible. Outside, a low sound moved beneath the ice, not a break. A warning that the inlet was still changing while they stood there. Laurel met Everett's eyes. "You came because you said no one would go alone," she said. "That cannot mean no one is allowed to choose." Everett did not answer. Not yet. Above them, Felix tested the manual crank once. The reflector moved a few inches, sending a brief bar of white sunlight across the wall. Then it stopped. The reflector stopped after moving only a few inches. A narrow bar of sunlight remained fixed across the machine room wall. cutting through the cold dust between Everett and Laurel. Above them, Felix released the manual crank. That answers one question, he called from the observation level. The mechanism still turns. And creates several others, Celeste said. She was crouched near the damaged staircase, studying where the bent steel frame pressed against the inner wall. Simon sat wrapped in blankets beside the equipment cabinet, one leg extended in front of him. Vesper remained against his side, her shoulder fitted beneath his hand, as if she had been placed there to hold him upright. Everett looked from Simon to the blocked stairs. We have enough information, he said. Yeah, we get everyone back across the inlet while the route still holds. Laurel stood opposite him, one hand resting on the jack they had used to free Simon. That is one option. It is the safe option. No, she said. It is the option that removes the danger closest to you. The words were quiet, but they changed the room. Everett straightened. The inlet is weakening. Simon is cold. Felix is trapped above us. The tower has already shifted once, and the greenhouse will lose reliable heat before night. We can use Northwind. If Northwind stays at the dock, the ice may close around it. If it leaves, the people here lose their fastest way off the island. If the helicopter turns back, Miriam loses access to the medication, and Jonah loses the part he needs to stabilize the generator. Everett's voice lowered. You are asking people to remain in a damaged structure while the weather deteriorates. I'm asking that the people taking the risk be allowed to help decide whether the risk is necessary. You think I do not understand necessity? Laurel's expression tightened, not with anger, but restraint. I think you understand it so well that you sometimes stop hearing anything else. Simon shifted beneath the blankets. Vesper lifted her head at the movement, then settled again when his breathing slowed. Celeste looked toward the open service door, where fine snow had begun moving across the rocks. We have perhaps 40 minutes before the eastern route becomes unreliable, she said. That is an estimate, not a guarantee. Everett turned back to Laurel. Then we do not spend those minutes debating. Agreed. For a moment, he believed she had accepted his decision. Then Laurel said, We spend them making one together. Everett felt the old resistance rise before he could stop it. There had always been a point in every operation when discussion became delay. Someone had to gather incomplete information and choose. For years, he had believed that willingness was what made a person dependable. After Curtis, he had come to believe it was what made a person dangerous. Laurel seemed to read the movement in his face. Curtis was not a passenger, she said. The name entered the room without warning. Everett glanced toward Simon and Celeste, but neither looked away. There was no privacy available in a lighthouse with one room, one broken staircase, and a deadline moving beneath the ice. Do not do this here, he said. Then where? You left every other place where we might have done it. His jaw tightened. You were not on the aircraft. No. You did not hear the warning system fail and return. You did not have Curtis waiting for a decision while the weather closed around us. No, Laurel repeated. But I read the report. I spoke with the crew. I spent 2 years watching you describe the mission as though Curtis had no training, no judgment, and no voice. Everett stared at her. I made the decision to continue. And Curtis agreed. I was in command. He was the rescue technician. He evaluated the approach from the cabin. He knew the conditions. He told you he believed the operation remained possible. He trusted me. Yes. The answer struck harder than blame. Laurel stepped closer. Trust is not obedience, Everett. Curtis was an experienced man who participated in a decision that turned out badly. You underestimated the speed of the weather change. He underestimated it too. The ground coordinator missed a pressure update. Maintenance had already reported an intermittent sensor. Several capable people made choices inside the same failing system. I was responsible for bringing him home. You were responsible for doing your part. You were not the weather, the aircraft, the sensor, Curtis, and every person on the radio. Everett's hands closed at his sides. You think dividing the responsibility makes the loss smaller? No. I think carrying all of it lets you pretend you were the only person whose choices mattered. The room seemed suddenly too narrow. Everett turned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the damaged footbridge lay across the white inlet, like a line someone had begun erasing. Laurel did not follow him. You turned Curtis into someone who only followed your command, she said. Perhaps because that is easier than accepting that good trained people can make the same wrong decision together. Everett looked back sharply. You do not get to tell me what is easier. No, Laurel said. I get to ask whether you are about to use that loss to make everyone's decision for them again. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Working silence. Celeste checked the anchor points. Simon adjusted the blankets. Felix tested the blocked stair frame with one boot. Vesper stood, stretched once, and crossed toward Everett when he called her name. Vesper, here. The dog stopped halfway between them. She looked at Everett, then at Laurel. Everett felt a brief sting that embarrassed him immediately. Vesper was not choosing which person she loved more. Laurel remained her primary handler. In uncertain conditions, the dog had been trained to wait for her direction. Laurel pointed to the coil of rescue line lying near the broken stairs. Vesper, bring. The shepherd picked up the rope by its padded center and carried it to Everett. He took it from her mouth. Thank you. Vesper remained near him for a moment, then returned to Simon when Laurel gave the signal. The action was simple and practical, yet it clarified something the argument had not. Vesper could be loyal to Laurel and still assist Everett. She could support Simon without abandoning either of them. Her role changed according to the task, because no single bond required every other bond to disappear. Everett looked down at the rope in his hands. All right, he said. Laurel waited. I will give the situation as I understand it. Everyone gets to challenge it. Felix leaned over the upper railing. That sounds almost democratic. Do not make me regret it. Now it sounds governmental. Even Simon smiled faintly. Everett spread the lighthouse maintenance diagram across a metal workbench. The lower stair support is damaged but currently stable. Celeste? Stable under its present load, she corrected. Movement near the eastern wall must be limited. Simon should not remain here. Tessa's voice came through the radio. Correct. His circulation is acceptable, but his temperature is still low. I want him back in the greenhouse as soon as the route allows. Time to helicopter approach? Everett asked. Delaney answered from North Wind. Current estimate 58 minutes. Air unit will make a final weather decision 20 minutes before arrival. Condition of the inlet? Celeste looked through the door. The eastern path remains usable with ropes and spacing. I would not take more than 3 people onto it at once. Simon needs a sled. Vesper should travel beside him, tethered separately. Laurel nodded. I will go with Simon. Everett almost objected automatically. He stopped himself. Reason? He responds to my voice, and I know Vesper's working commands. Celeste manages the route. I manage Simon and the dog. Celeste agreed. Everett marked the assignment on the diagram. Felix remains above until we build a controlled descent. I have found a secondary anchor, Felix said. Old inspection ring on the western column. It held maintenance loads before the stair renovation. Celeste examined the point from below. I need to see the mounting plate. Felix cleared dust and aimed his flashlight. Celeste studied it through binoculars. Corrosion is limited. Use it only as a stabilizing point, not the primary line. Felix looked at Everett. I can rig the main line through the intact roof beam. You feed the lower end around the twisted frame. I move under my own weight. Everett understood the importance of the phrasing. Felix was not asking to be carried from the observation level. He was offering a procedure based on his own experience. What do you need from me? Everett asked. Keep the line away from that sharp corner. If it begins to rub, tell me before it damages the sheath, and do not pull unless I ask. Understood. Laurel secured Simon onto the narrow maintenance sled Celeste had found behind the service building. Vesper watched each strap being fastened, then stood when Laurel attached a separate line to the dog's harness. Simon's breathing quickened when a low vibration passed beneath the inlet. Vesper leaned against his shoulder. He closed one hand around the padded handle of her harness. I am beginning to understand why she ignores most of what I say. She does not ignore you, Laurel said. She sorts by usefulness. That is worse. It is more honest. Before Laurel left, she faced Everett. Once Felix is down, inspect the manual drive. Do not promise the helicopter a beacon until you know 2 people can operate it. I will report what we find. Not what you hope. Everett met her eyes. Not what I hope. Celeste led the way back across the inlet, testing the eastern route again. Laurel followed with the sled, while Vesper walked beside Simon at the length of her line. The dog looked back once. Everett lifted a hand. Then they moved beyond the lighthouse wall and disappeared into the reflected brightness. He turned to Felix. Show me the roof beam. The rescue took 12 minutes. Felix worked methodically, speaking each step before making it. Everett fed the rope around the bent steel frame and protected it with a folded section of canvas. When Felix shifted his weight from the damaged stairs to the line, the structure gave a small creak, but did not move. Hold tension, Felix said. I have it. Do not increase. I am not. Felix lowered himself past the blocked section. His old fire service coat caught briefly on a torn bracket. He freed it without panic and continued until both boots touched the machine room floor. Everett released the line. Felix stood still for a moment, breathing harder than he wanted anyone to notice. Then he looked upward. I liked the room better when I could leave it. Everett gathered the rope. You handled it. That is not the same thing. Felix sat on a low equipment case and rubbed warmth into his hands. Warehouse roof came down during my last year with the department, he said. Partial collapse. No one lost their life. One firefighter injured his back and never returned to full duty. Everett did not ask why Felix was telling him. I had seen the sag in the roofline, Felix continued. I thought we had time to finish the interior sweep. I gave the order to stay another minute. Was it against procedure? No. Did anyone challenge it? One man suggested we withdraw. Another agreed with me. The injured firefighter said the room still looked stable. Felix looked toward the broken staircase. I spent 5 years telling myself I alone kept them inside. It sounded like accountability. Mostly it gave me an excuse never to lead again. Everett leaned against the workbench. How did you stop? I did not. I became a sculptor and started making heavy things that could not ask me for decisions. Despite himself, Everett laughed once. Felix smiled. Chukotams, we can turn responsibility into a locked room, he said. Then call the room loyalty because that sounds nobler than fear. The line stayed with Everett as they inspected the beacon drive. The main LED array responded when Felix connected the temporary test battery. The motor remained frozen, but the mechanical crank engaged the reflector through a backup gear. They took turns. Even with both hands, the crank resisted each rotation. A layer of ice inside the housing made the mechanism uneven, tightening and releasing at different points. One person could manage a few minutes, Felix said. Two could maintain a useful pattern through the approach. Everett checked the radio. North wind, Lighthouse. Manual operation is possible. Requires 2 operators rotating shifts. Jonah answered first. Chukkum. We can supply temporary power to the radio through the shore service cable if Delaney positions near the northeast mooring. Delaney followed. Northwind's searchlight can mark the edge of open water from the bay. We cannot hold that position once the wind pushes the larger ice sheets north. Celeste called from the greenhouse. Receiving zone can be marked beside the main dock. We have emergency lamps, orange tarps, and clear approach space from the southeast. Tessa added, Simon is inside. Temperature improving. Ruth is preparing Miriam's medication list for the aircrew. Everett placed the lighthouse diagram beside the old winter route chart. The plan formed through the radio, one correction at a time. Northwind would mark the open water and provide temporary electrical support. The lighthouse would create the rotating reference point. The greenhouse team would prepare the receiving zone. Celeste would continue monitoring the inlet and wind. Adrian would maintain contact with the state air unit. No one asked Everett for a final declaration. They asked whether his section could perform its part. He looked at Felix. Felix placed both hands on the crank and tested its resistance once more. We can do it, he said. For the approach window, not indefinitely. Everett keyed the radio. Lighthouse confirms manual beacon capability within limits. 2 operators required. We proceed only if weather, vessel position, and receiving zone are all confirmed. Delaney's answer came through immediately. Recorded. Everett released the button. The plan did not belong to him. It did not belong to Laurel, Delaney, or any single person holding a radio. It existed between them, each part dependent on someone else speaking honestly about what could and could not be done. Outside, the fixed beam of sunlight had shifted away from the machine room wall. Felix placed one hand on the crank. Everett placed his on the opposite grip. Neither man turned it yet. They waited for the rest of the system to be ready. The return across the inlet took longer than the first crossing. Celeste moved ahead of the sled, testing the eastern route again, even though less than half an hour had passed. The wind had begun combing the loose snow away from the surface, exposing gray ice beneath. Every few yards, she stopped to inspect a marker or listen to the low movement underfoot. Laurel pulled from the front, while a safety rope connected her to Simon's sled. Vesper walked beside him on a separate line, close enough for Simon to rest one hand on the padded handle of her harness. Whenever the ice made a sound, Simon tried to raise himself. Each time, Vesper leaned against the sled. Stay flat, Laurel reminded him. I am only checking our progress. You are checking whether panic improves visibility. It might. It has not so far. His humor remained thin, but it meant he was still engaged with the people around him, rather than the ice below. By the time they reached solid ground, Simon's hands had stopped shaking as sharply. Ruth and Tessa met them near the greenhouse with blankets, heated packs, and a folding stretcher. Tessa took one look at Simon's face and pointed toward the entrance. "You are going inside. I need to explain the lighthouse controls. You may explain them while lying down. I work better upright. You currently do nothing better upright." Ruth opened the greenhouse door. Warm air rolled out, damp with soil and propane heat. Vesper remained beside Simon until Laurel released her from the working command. Only then did the dog turn and press briefly against Laurel's legs. Laurel crouched, placing both hands along Vesper's neck. "You did exactly right." The shepherd touched her nose to Laurel's chin. Then Simon's breathing quickened again, as Tessa began removing his wet outer layers. Vesper immediately looked back. Laurel understood. "Go." The dog crossed the greenhouse and lay beside Simon's cot. There was no hesitation between loyalty and duty. Laurel had taught her that the two could occupy the same room. Outside, Miriam was already organizing the receiving zone. She had exchanged her gray-violet shawl for a camel winter coat and stood beside the island dock with Ruth's notebook tucked under one arm. Two residents carried orange tarps from the maintenance shed, while another cleared loose snow with a wide shovel. "We need a cross visible from the air," Miriam said, "not an abstract interpretation of one." The first tarp had been laid at an angle. A bundled volunteer adjusted it immediately. Tessa appeared in the greenhouse doorway. "Keep the landing zone farther from the glass. Rotor wash can throw loose material." Miriam measured the distance with her eyes. "Move everything 20 feet toward the dock." No one argued. The island had become a system of short instructions passed from one competent person to another. Inside the generator shed, Jonah and Boyd had reached less encouraging conclusions. The old backup generator had started, but the lights connected to it pulsed every few seconds. Jonah watched the voltage meter while Boyd knelt beside the open control panel, his red shop rag spread beneath a row of removed screws. "The regulator is failing under load," Jonah said over the radio. "We can keep communications powered and perhaps one heater, nothing more." "Can it be bypassed?" Delaney asked from Northwind. Boyd's answer arrived before Jonah could speak. "Only if we want the wiring to become the next emergency. Then we do not bypass it. Best decision anyone has made all morning." Jonah adjusted the load again. "The replacement regulator from the air unit is necessary. Without it, the greenhouse cannot remain warm through the night." At the lighthouse, Everett and Felix listened from the machine room. The temporary radio had begun working after Northwind moved into the sheltered water northeast of the point. Boyd had passed a marine-rated power cable from the ferry's service reel to the lighthouse connection box. It provided enough current for the transmitter and test lamp, but not enough to operate the frozen motor. Felix leaned into the manual crank. The reflector moved in a slow circle. A pale bar of light traveled around the room, crossed the windows, and briefly flashed over the snow outside before returning. "One complete rotation in 14 seconds, Felix said. "The aircrew requested between 12 and 16, Laurel replied through the radio. She had returned from the greenhouse with Celeste after Simon was stable. The crossing was still passable, but Celeste had warned that it might be the last safe trip made on foot before the wind changed. Everett watched Laurel check the radio connections. "You could have stayed with Vesper." "She is working." "With Simon?" "Yes." "You trust her to know where she is needed." "I trust her training, and I trust Ruth and Tessa to tell me if the situation changes." Laurel tightened one cable connection. "Those are not the same thing as trusting the universe." Everett almost smiled. Felix released the crank. "Your turn." Everett took position. The handle was colder than before, despite his gloves. Each rotation tightened near the same point, where frozen moisture had collected inside the gear housing. The motion required patience more than strength. If he forced it, the gear could slip or the shaft could bend. He found the rhythm. Pull, guide, ease through the resistance, release. The beam moved. Through the window, Everett could see Northwind shifting slowly beyond the rocky point. Delaney was placing the vessel where its searchlight could mark the edge of open water without bringing the cooling intake too close to drifting ice. Celeste's voice came over the radio. Wind northwest at 18 knots. Gusting 23. Visibility beginning to fall beyond the western shore. Northwind is holding 200 yards northeast of the point, Delaney replied. Engineering? Jonah answered from the ferry's machinery channel. Intake temperature acceptable. Maintain minimum maneuvering power. Boyd added, searchlight ready. On the mainland, Adrian coordinated through the state emergency frequency. Air unit has final authorization. Medical transfer corridor to Aurora Bay Hospital is cleared. County Plow is holding the access road open. Everett heard paper shifting near Adrian's microphone. The administrator was probably surrounded by forms, authorizations, and phone lines, while everyone else stood in snow, machinery, or wind. His work looked nothing like rescue. Yet without it, the helicopter might have been required to turn back before reaching the island. Air unit estimates 21 minutes, Adrian said. The greenhouse team confirmed the receiving zone. Miriam had arranged the orange tarps into a wide cross. Battery lamps marked the outer corners. Tessa secured every loose blanket, bag, and tool that could be lifted by rotor wash. Ruth prepared this medication list and a warm area for the arriving technical responder. For several minutes, the plan seemed almost orderly. Then the lighthouse beam stopped. Everett pushed against the crank. It did not move. Felix came beside him. Ice buildup? Or the bearing shifted. Together they eased the handle backward. The mechanism gave a dull metallic knock, but remained fixed. Laurel looked at the clock. 17 minutes. Everett removed his gloves and touched the gearbox housing. One side was colder than the other. Moisture has frozen near the lower bearing. Felix opened the maintenance cover. We cannot disassemble it before the helicopter arrives. No. Everett looked toward a narrow copper line running beside the gear casing. What is that? Old de-icing loop. Simon stopped using it when the heater failed. Can we feed it from the radio circuit? Laurel shook her head. Too much draw. Felix studied the line. It does not need full power. We only need enough warmth to release the bearing. Everett keyed the radio. Jonah, Lighthouse. Can Northwind supply a short load increase through the service cable? How much? Felix read the heater specification plate. Jonah calculated aloud. Possible for 90 seconds. We would need to reduce the searchlight and cabin systems during that interval. Delaney responded. Searchlight is not yet required. Do it. Boyd interrupted. Service cable connector must be checked first. If ice has entered the coupling, additional load could trip the line. Laurel grabbed a flashlight and went to the exterior connection box. Everett waited beside the frozen crank. This delay did not belong to one person. Every solution created work somewhere else. Laurel confirmed the connection was dry. Jonah redirected the power. The copper line warmed slowly. Water appeared along the bottom of the gear housing and ran in a thin line toward the floor. Felix tested the crank. It moved half an inch. Again. They waited 10 more seconds. The handle turned. The reflector resumed its circle. No one celebrated. Adrian's voice had already returned with a new estimate. Air unit 12 minutes out. Felix took the first shift. Everett stepped away, flexing his hands. The sound reached them before the aircraft became visible, a low beating above the clouds. Everett stopped breathing properly. The lighthouse room remained in front of him, but his body responded to another place. The vibration entered through the stone floor and rose into his chest. Radio static sharpened. The rotating beam passed over Laurel's face, then Felix's hands, then the stairwell. The aircraft was not yet in sight. That made the sound worse. Memory supplied what the windows could not. A rescue cabin. White glare. Curtis near the open side door, checking the line while the weather narrowed around them. Everett's hand closed around the edge of the workbench. Felix glanced toward him but kept turning the crank. He did not say, "You are safe." Laurel did not tell Everett to be strong. Delaney's voice came over the radio instead. "Northwind stable at northeast marker." Celeste followed. "Crosswind remains within the approach limit." Tessa spoke from the greenhouse. "Simon is in, temperature improving." Ruth added, "Medication list prepared. Receiving zone clear." A pause. Then Laurel stood at the radio and looked directly at Everett. "Vesper is with Simon." He heard the simple fact beneath the rotor sound. Vesper was not lost on the ice. Laurel was not missing. Felix was no longer trapped above the broken stairs. No one was hanging beneath an aircraft waiting for Everett to make an impossible decision alone. Adrian's voice arrived last. "All personnel accounted for." Everett looked around the machine room. Felix controlled the crank. Laurel controlled communication. Delaney held Northwind in position. Celeste watched the weather. Tessa and Ruth protected Simon. Jonah and Boyd managed the power and engines. Miriam held the receiving team together. Everett was not enclosed in a cockpit with responsibility narrowing toward him from every direction. He was one point in a network of people reporting the truth to one another. The helicopter appeared beneath the cloud layer. Its dark shape approached from the southeast, slowed, then shifted slightly as the pilot read the lighthouse and water markers. "Searchlight on," Delaney ordered. Northwind's beam rose through the snow, marking the boundary between the dark water and the pale ice. Felix's arms began to tire. The lighthouse rotation slowed. Everett stepped forward. "I have it." Felix did not resist. He moved aside and shook, feeling back into his hands. Everett took the crank. The rotor sound pressed against the tower. For one rotation, his hands faltered. Laurel crossed the room and placed both hands on the opposite grip. She did not take the mechanism away from him. She shared the weight. Together they pulled through the frozen resistance. The reflector turned at a steady pace, sending its white signal across the inlet. At the dock, the orange tarps and emergency lamps became visible through the blowing snow. The helicopter held above the marked area rather than landing. A cable descended from its open side. A technical responder followed, boots reaching the snow as the receiving team guided the line away from the greenhouse. Next came a compact generator, a sealed medical container, and the replacement voltage regulator. The wind increased during the final lowering. Snow lifted from the island in a wide cloud. Miriam and Tessa held their positions at the edge of the receiving zone, signaling the flight crew, while Ruth kept the greenhouse door closed against the blowing cold. "Final load on the ground," Adrian reported. The responder disconnected the hook. The cable rose. The helicopter banked toward the southeast. Everett and Laurel continued turning the beacon. "Northwind, Ice movement increasing near your stern, Celeste warned. Delaney responded immediately. Lighthouse, we are leaving the marker position. The searchlight lowered as north wind began moving toward the southern channel. Jonah kept engine power restricted, while Boyd monitored the intake temperature. A broad sheet of ice drifted toward the place where the ferry had been holding. North wind cleared it with only minutes to spare. The lighthouse beam remained active until the helicopter passed beyond the western snow band and confirmed it no longer needed visual guidance. Air unit clear of the island, Adrian said. Everett and Laurel completed one final turn. Then they allowed the reflector to stop. The sudden silence of the mechanism felt larger than the rotor noise had been. Felix sat against the equipment cabinet, breathing hard but smiling. Laurel kept one hand on the crank. Everett looked through the window. North wind was moving safely toward the main dock. At the greenhouse, Jonah and Boyd were already crossing the snow to install the new regulator. The technical responder carried the generator case with Miriam directing him toward the correct shed. Everywhere he looked, someone was completing a piece of the work. There had been no single moment when the island was saved, no perfect decision, no person whose courage outweighed everyone else's limits, only many hands holding different parts of the same light. Everett released the crank. For the first time in 10 years, being necessary did not feel the same as being alone. 3 weeks after the storm, every chair in the Aurora Bay Council room was occupied. Wet boots lined the walls beneath radiators that clicked without producing enough heat. Residents stood behind the final row, holding folded coats and paper cups of coffee. Through the tall windows, late afternoon snow moved across the harbor in thin, orderly lines. At the front of the room, a map of Cedar Lantern Island had been enlarged and pinned to a corkboard. Several red circles marked the failures from the emergency: the damaged footbridge, the greenhouse generator, the lighthouse radio, and the winterized north wind. Adrian Cross stood beside the map in a dark suit and green sweater. The careful appearance suited the part of the work that remained after the machinery had stopped, and everyone was safely home. The winter residency should be suspended, he said. The room answered with low murmurs. Adrian waited for them to fade. I am not recommending permanent closure. I am recommending that the island remain unoccupied between December and March until the town can guarantee reliable transport, power, and communications. Miriam Tate sat in the first row with her gray-violet shawl folded across one arm. She had returned from Cedar Lantern with the rest of the residents after the weather cleared, but she had not returned quietly. You cannot guarantee those things on the mainland either, she said. Adrian looked toward her. No, but emergency services can reach the mainland by road, unless the roads close, which is why the town maintains plows, backup routes, and mutual aid agreements. Miriam rose. Exactly. She carried no notes to the lectern. Her silver fountain pen remained clipped inside her coat, unused. The island did not become dangerous because people were staying there, she said. It became dangerous because Aurora Bay allowed 4 essential systems to depend upon single points of failure. She turned toward the map. 1 generator without a working spare regulator, 1 radio station, 1 footbridge overdue for repair, 1 ferry without a documented winter activation crew. Adrian folded his hands. The result could have been far worse. That is not an argument for abandoning the island. It is an argument for correcting the system. A council member asked whether the residents had understood the risks when they joined the winter program. Miriam's expression sharpened. We understood isolation, weather, and limited transport. We were not informed that the emergency generator had not been tested under a full winter load or that the footbridge inspection had been delayed twice. Adrian did not deny it. The room shifted toward Everett when his name was called. He had chosen a seat along the side wall rather than the front. Vesper lay beneath Laurel's chair several feet away, wearing only her brown leather collar and brass Lighthouse tag. Her work harness was folded beside Laurel's boots. Everett approached the lectern carrying a thin binder. He wore a slate blue shirt beneath his old navy coat. The rescue watch remained on his wrist, its orange second hand moving steadily beneath the fluorescent lights. People expected a story. He could see it in their faces. They wanted to hear about the crossing, the failing ice and the helicopter appearing through the snow. They wanted the moment Everett had taken the crank and kept the lighthouse beam moving. He opened the binder instead. At 11:53, Northwind's primary navigation display lost data for 12 seconds, he said. Yeah, we continued using compass bearings, visual markers, and the paper route survey. The room became quieter. At 12:16, the cooling intake temperature rose because ice fragments entered the southern channel. Engineering reduced power. That slowed the crossing and reduced maneuvering options. He turned a page. The vessel succeeded because Jonah Kessler and Boyd Kellerman had 90 minutes to restore the winterized systems. In a faster emergency, Northwind would not have been available. He described the displaced buoy, the missing backup regulator, and the lighthouse battery. He explained how the aircrew needed 2 visual references and how the inlet route became unusable shortly after Simon had been moved. He did not omit his own limitations. When the navigation alarm sounded, I lost several seconds of effective attention. Other people kept the vessel on course. During the helicopter approach, I stopped operating the beacon crank until Laurel and Felix supported the task. A council member leaned toward the microphone. Are you saying you were unable to perform your assignment? I am saying the assignment was completed because the plan did not depend on one person performing perfectly. The answer changed the room more than a dramatic account would have. Everett closed the binder. Northwind reaching the island does not prove the system worked. It proves a group of people compensated for a system that had not been prepared. He returned to his seat. No applause followed. He was grateful for that. The hearing continued for nearly 3 hours. Some residents supported closing Cedar Lantern for the winter. Others argued that the island's residency program brought money and purpose to Aurora Bay during its quietest months. Laurel spoke near the end. She did not defend the program by describing its emotional value. Instead, she placed a proposal on this council table. The plan created a winter access cooperative involving the town, island residents, licensed mariners, medical volunteers, and local businesses. Northwind would remain municipal property. The cooperative would not command the ferry or replace professional crews. Its role would be narrower and more demanding. It would raise maintenance funds, coordinate training, support emergency drills, and ensure that the people using Cedar Lantern participated in preparing for its risks. This is not a promise that the island will always remain open, Laurel said. Some days, weather will close it. The difference is that closure should be based on current conditions, not on neglected equipment or fear of responsibility. Adrian read the proposal without expression. Then he said, "This cannot be approved tonight." Several people groaned. Laurel only nodded. "I know. It requires state review, new insurance terms, and a licensed operating agreement." "I know that too." Adrian looked at her over the top of the document. "You wrote this knowing it would take months." "I wrote it because anything worth trusting should take longer than one emotional meeting." For the first time that evening, Adrian smiled, only slightly. The island remained closed for the rest of that winter. No one called the decision a victory. That spring, the the damaged footbridge was removed. Engineers designed a replacement with flexible joints that could be detached before major ice movement. Simon installed a second radio battery at the lighthouse and placed the backup set in a heated enclosure. He also added a manual drive inspection to the monthly maintenance schedule. "I preferred the system when it waited 10 years to become my problem," he told Felix. Felix tightened a support bracket. "The system did not wait. You did." Simon considered that and handed him the correct wrench without replying. Jonah and Boyd rebuilt Northwind's cooling intake guard and installed a new monitoring sensor. They wrote a winter activation checklist detailed enough to satisfy Adrian and irritating enough to satisfy Boyd. Delaney began recruiting additional licensed operators. When Everett offered to help, she handed him a blank training schedule. "You are not filling every line with your name." "I had not planned to." "You were thinking about it." "I was considering availability." "You were considering control in a respectable sweater." Everett looked at the blank spaces. "How many operators?" "3 besides you. Minimum." He wrote the number at the top of the page. That decision became harder when the first candidates arrived. Everett had expected to teach navigation. Instead, he found himself watching other people make small errors with equipment he knew how to use better. A trainee approached a marker too quickly during the first harbor exercise. Everett's hand moved toward the throttle. He stopped before touching it. "What do you see, Heitzen?" he asked. The trainee checked the range. "Closing distance too fast." "Your correction?" "Reduce power and turn 2 degrees to port." "Do it." The Ferry responded. No damage occurred. No one needed Everett to seize the controls. Yet after the exercise, he stood alone in the wheelhouse for several minutes, staring at the place where his hand had almost taken over. Vesper found him there. She had come aboard with Laurel for the afternoon run and wore her teal work harness. The dog stopped near the doorway, watching his shoulders and hands. "I am not in distress," Everett told her. Vesper remained where she was. Everett looked at his grip on the edge of the console. He released it. "Fine. Mild distress." Vesper walked over and sat beside his left leg. The work continued through summer. Celeste installed ice temperature sensors near the southern channel and a small secondary weather station on Cedar Lantern. Tessa and Ruth designed a first aid course specifically for cold exposure and limited access locations. Miriam attended every planning meeting and objected whenever the language treated island residents as cargo rather than participants. Adrian spent months negotiating insurance terms. His contribution had no photographs attached to it. There were no winter landscapes or dramatic radio calls, only meetings, revised clauses, and pages returned with red markings. By September, the town had an operating agreement. The cooperative could fund equipment, support drills, and provide trained volunteers. Northwind remained under Delaney's authority. Winter crossings required weather approval, an engineering sign-off, and at least 2 licensed operators. No crossing could depend entirely upon Everett. He had requested that clause himself. At the signing meeting, Adrian slid the final document across the table. "You understand that this may prevent you from operating in an emergency if another licensed person is unavailable?" "Yes." "You insisted on it anyway?" "Yes." Adrian studied him. "Why?" Everett looked through the council room window toward Northwind. "Because a system should survive the absence of the person who designed it." Adrian signed. By early December, Cedar Lantern reopened for a limited winter season. Laurel continued to manage the residency program. She and Everett did not define what had changed between them. They drank coffee during inspection runs. They argued about radio placement. Laurel accused him of organizing her tool cabinet without permission. Everett pointed out that she could now find everything inside it. Neither called that agreement. Vesper continued living with Laurel on the island, but she often rode Northwind during training days. Some mornings she slept near the passenger heater. On others she chose the wheelhouse, especially when Everett was teaching. The first full winter drill took place beneath a clear sky almost identical to the morning Vesper had rung the bell. Snow covered Aurora Bay. Cedar Lantern's beacon rotated steadily in the distance. A new operator stood at Northwind's controls, while Everett observed from the second position. Delaney supervised from the rear of the wheelhouse, and Celeste read wind data beside the chart table. Vesper lay near the doorway. The trainee reached across the console to adjust a radio setting and accidentally caught the emergency bell line with his sleeve. The bell rang above the deck. Everett froze. The sound entered his chest before it became thought. His breathing changed. Vesper was on her feet immediately. She crossed the wheelhouse and pressed her shoulder against his leg. Everett rested one hand along her neck. The trainee turned from the controls. "Sir?" Everett looked at the radio in the young man's hand. The old instinct told him to take it, confirm the channel, and restore order before anyone noticed the pause. He did not. "You heard the alarm," Everett said. "What is your first step?" The trainee hesitated, then checked the panel. "Confirm whether it is a real signal or an accidental activation." "Do that." The trainee used the radio. "Deck team, wheelhouse. Confirm emergency bell status." Delaney answered from the stern. "Accidental activation, no emergency." Celeste looked at her instrument display. "Wind northwest at 9 knots. Southern route remains within drill limits." The trainee waited. Everett nodded toward the throttle. "Continue on the assigned heading. I will verify." Northwind moved beyond the harbor wall. The bell's final vibration faded into the engine noise. Vesper stayed against Everett until his breathing settled. Then she returned to the space between the two operating chairs and lay down. Ahead, Cedar Lantern grew larger through the wheelhouse glass. Everett had once believed responsibility meant bringing everyone home through the force of his own judgment. Now he understood it differently. Responsibility meant teaching someone else how to read the water. It meant writing procedures that allowed another person to challenge a decision. It meant maintaining a route even on days when he was not the one steering. Northwind continued across the winter bay beneath the slow sweep of the lighthouse. The light did not belong to Everett. The route did not depend upon him. That was not the loss of purpose he had once feared. It was proof that the work could continue. Sometimes strength is not taking control of every problem. Sometimes it is trusting another person with the wheel, listening when someone sees what we cannot, and building something strong enough to continue without us. Everett did not find peace by becoming the hero again. He found it when he understood that no one was ever meant to carry every life, every decision, and every loss alone. In our own lives, the smallest act of grace may be allowing someone to stand beside us and share the weight. What part of Everett and Vesper's journey stayed with you? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, courage, and the quiet strength that brings people home. May peace find you, and may you never forget that asking for help is also an act of courage.